And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Well, if you're like me, you're probably a social media junkie. Maybe you hang around YouTube way too much, and you watch a lot of like high level, very sophisticated, complex apologetics and debates and so on. And that's fine and dandy, but really when it comes to real life, it's not so much the super sophisticated, highly complex arguments that you run into, but it's usually much more simple. In fact, there's a lot of arguments that you would call low-hanging fruit arguments because they're so easy to pick. And although they're not very tasty, I must say. So Kyle Whittington, welcome back to Hands on Apologetics.
All right. Thanks, Gary. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And congratulations in advance on the new coming baby. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, it's great. It's the best kind of chaos. So, but yeah, no, you bring up a good point that one thought that I had was that if you're listening to this show right now, chances are you're pretty familiar with the apologetic scene and you're just trying to sharpen your skills. So you're familiar with these guys who are like the heavyweights in apologetics on like the Protestant side, such as Dr. Gavin Ortlund and whatnot. However, whenever you take it down to like the street level, a lot of these guys have no idea who Gavin Ortlund is or his arguments against iconography and whatnot. And it's, whenever you have these conversations with normal people, their arguments are really based off of, their anti-Catholic arguments are based off of kind of nonsense that they grew up hearing. And, at the same time, and that doesn't make them stupid. That just makes them a normal person. So that's why I think that like these kinds of arguments, these like super easy anti-Catholic arguments are worth addressing and getting really well versed in because, this is what really is the problem. Yeah. So and that's like if you're the kind of person who's listening to this show right now, you're weird in like the best possible kind of way. So yeah, I want to talk a bit about these kinds of arguments that pop up that we've all heard. And I just want to just let's tear them down a little bit and have a little fun with it.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why you have low hanging fruit is precisely because the people making the arguments don't watch opponent's videos. They just already have their conclusions and they're just firing blind.
Yeah. I did a low-hanging fruit stream last night. So I don't want to say that I'm quite proud of this, but I'm very pleased with the result. So if you go onto YouTube right now and type in the bastardization of Christianity, you'll see that. Yeah, you'll see the 2-part sermon that this guy gave. But then the third result is my refutation of the first part. So I'm starting to just give them the same titles that these things have, so that way if somebody does go looking for them, they can see that I've basically hit back, and that's I'm very pleased seeing that result.
Yeah, and I mean, hey, if it's clickbait, that type of title, why not? Exactly. It's turnabout's fair play. Plus, you help people who are trying to find the video to realize, wow, somebody actually commented on it. Is all low-hanging fruit the same, or does it kind of fall into different categories?
Well, you'll always hear some of the same arguments repeated, and it's really funny whenever you're listening to these arguments. You can usually like pause it and say, "This is the point that he's about to lead into, and he's going to make this point," and I've started making the low-hanging fruit a drinking game. So it's like every time they say something that's explicitly wrong about the church, take a drink. And some of them get kind of dangerous because it's like, okay, make sure you're drinking Yingling or something that's on the lighter side, because otherwise, the game's going to end in the hospital. But like I'll go ahead and like start raising my beer because it's just like, yep, he's gonna do it. He's gonna do it. One of some of the my pet favorite terrible arguments is going to be like, oh, Catholics engage in idol worship and Mary worship. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard that one before. I don't know if you've come across that one.
No, I never heard anybody ever.
Yeah.
That's definitely low hanging fruit. You hear all over the place.
Yeah. And my first response to that is always, I worship Mary. I'm sorry. What is that? What is worship? If I had no concept of what worship is, how would you explain it to me? And then, because you might as well be speaking different languages if they're saying like, oh, prayer is worship. And I've heard like Mike Gendron say that explicitly, prayer is worship. It's like, well, no, not always. If I ask anybody to do anything, am I worshiping them? No, that's all that means. So a lot of
Right.
times it's just a distinction in terms. And then, of course, like you bring in sacrifice, and I've seen an inflammatory like response to this. It's an oversimplification. I wouldn't recommend people using this, but they say, like I've heard people say, well, Protestants don't even worship God. So that's why what we do, that's why when we venerate Mary and the saints, it looks like worship to them because they only venerate God. Now, let me go ahead and like dismantle that real quick, because as long as you're recognizing God as God, that is still an act of adoration, therefore an act of worship. So, so that's a low hanging fruit argument from like a Catholic perspective. So, but yeah, so that's one of the biggest things, just have that conversation of like, what is actually the nature of worship and how am I engaging in it? Because whenever you really get down to it, it's like, well, you're treating her like God. It's like, no, I'm not. I don't think that she's God. And whenever you say like, oh, well, you don't think she's God, it's like, okay, so what you're saying is your argument is actually a baseless accusation. It's not a real argument. And from there, you can move the conversation forward.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. You need to define terms at the outset. And the low-hanging fruit, I mean, I think that's the bread and butter of all these low-hanging fruit arguments is they love to live in the ambiguity in the language, and so on the surface, it sounds plausible. But when you start asking them to define things, that's when it falls apart. Since these are arguments that people put forward that really haven't looked into, whether they're true or really thought critically about it, it's probably not good to blast them with a whole bunch of, facts or verses or, real hard data, but maybe just to get them to think. And I know that's kind of one of your techniques is to just get them to think, yeah, that just doesn't sound right when you put it that way.
Yeah. And actually, this isn't an apologetic book, but it's a fantastic read. It's a secular book, but it's called Never Split the Difference. And it's by this guy named Chris Voss. And he's an FBI hostage negotiator, or he's a retired one. He used to be like the lead international hostage negotiator. And I read that. And one of the lines in that book that's really stuck out to me is that like true negotiation is letting someone else have your way. So that's basically what I'm trying to frame these questions on is just like, I want you to see things the way that I'm seeing them in a way that makes sense to you. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, I can destroy someone with facts and logic and whatnot. But well, now that person's walking away dejected, which quite honestly, like if somebody's watching if a Protestant watches my low hanging fruit videos, like they're probably going to be unconvinced because there's no relationship there. I don't know this person. I don't know the way that they think. It's whenever you're doing YouTube, it's like a shot in the dark, and it might convince somebody, but chances are for the most part, it's not going to convince anybody. And that's why like the real intention is just the education of Catholics.
And this is why I love, because you inject a lot of humor and all sorts of different things, because it's usually the low-hanging fruit that's really obnoxious. I mean,
oh yeah,
it's tough not to respond in like form, to be just as obnoxious back, kind of like what you intimated in the previous segment.
Oh yeah. Well, and you always want to, and it's YouTube, so if it's not entertaining, nobody's going to watch it. Yeah. So, and it's like this isn't a liturgy or anything like that. This is just some guy with a camera, just sounding off basically. So yeah, I feel like humor is appropriate and whatnot. So I think I've gotten a lot of really good response from it. People have gone. I love getting the comments of like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way before, and it was just like, yes. Yeah. So
there you go.
This is actually one that I want people to know that this is a red flag. Especially Catholics need to know that this is a red flag because, I've noticed a lot of these low-hanging fruit guys, they'll brag about converting Catholics, and it's just like that's a concern. And while we do want to reach souls too, another objective that we need to have in the church is to stop the bleeding. Basically, get people to stop leaving because that's just as important as well. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I want people to know is that there's certain things that you can hear in somebody's conversation, and that should tip you off. It's a red flag, and this is just the red flag to like stop taking someone seriously. And I want Protestants to even realize this too, that they're being insanely arrogant, and and I touched on it a little bit before we got started or in the last segment was Catholics don't like this verse, or Catholics don't know about this verse, or something like that. And I just think that is the height of arrogance to say that Catholics don't know about this verse, because for most of church's history, I know this might come as a shocker to some of the listeners here, but for most of church history, the television didn't exist. So what were people like? What was the church doing with the Bible? Well, there were people that dedicated their lives. There's commentary on it. I've got, the people who are watching will see this. I've got the Catena Aria right here, which is a compilation from St. Thomas Aquinas. He got all the commentaries of the early church fathers and compiled them into like one work. So that way you could see the commentary on every single verse in the Gospels. So whenever you hear someone say, Catholics don't know about this, you know that they're immediately wrong. Every single verse is counted for in the Bible. And it's just one of those things of, it's almost like if somebody comes up to you and says, hey man, I know how to get rich. You go to this website and you'll get a pop-up that says, click here to win $1 million. If somebody says that to you in earnest, you know that like they make terrible decisions. This person's very naive, and you should probably not take them seriously. Listen to them out of a sense of charity, but like definitely don't let them give you advice for your life.
That's a great one. And I've encountered that a lot. It's almost like, here's a verse that, for 2,000 years, the entire church, over 1 billion people, have just skipped over, never really, it's, yeah. How in the world does that work? Like you pointed out, especially since, for a good part of history, the transmission of the text was through monks copying it. Obviously, they copied the verse.